The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the producers and the individuals appearing on this program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the staff of the Sun Prairie Media Center, its members or underwriters, the board members of the Media Center Commission, Charter Communications, TDS Telecom, or the staff and elected officials of the City of Sun Prairie.
Hi, this is John Quinlan, and welcome to this edition of Forward Forum. Throughout the next hour, we're going to be having what I know is going to be a fascinating conversation, one I've wanted to have for some time now. We're recording this on February 15th, 2019, and in a moment, we're going to be speaking with Jen Rubin. She is the author of We Are Staying, 80 Years in the Life of a Family, a Store in a Neighborhood. It's a fascinating story about the radio store that has been in her family for multiple generations, that existed on the Upper West Side of New York at 98th and Broadway, and how over time the store maintained its presence in the neighborhood as changes were occurring, ultimately being victim to the gentrification process in New York. Something that has some resonance, I think, with what's happened in Madison and Dane County recently is longtime businesses, locally owned businesses have been forced to shut down. It's a story of perseverance and courage. It's a story in which Jen's family figures prominently. And even though it takes place out east on the East Coast, New York, I think it's something we can all relate to. I just wanted to read the blurb that John Nichols has written. The best political stories are the human ones, and Jen Rubin recognizes this. We Are Staying as a remarkably powerful, poignantly told story of a family, a business, a neighborhood, and a city. Anyone who cares about urban policy, the history and the future of New York City, and of a country that suffers from so much division, this has the potential still to unite and cherish this book. Hey, Jen Rubin, welcome to Forward Forum.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
It's so great to have you here. So let's start at a basic place. I will hand the book over to you again, but what's the meaning behind the title, We Are Staying?
So, We Are Staying refers to, in 1977, New York City and the surrounding area, actually, into some of the suburban areas, suffered a blackout. So for 25 hours, it was a huge heat wave, and for 25 hours, power went out everywhere.
I remember it well. It was on the cover of Time magazine, Newsweek. I mean, made the news. I mean, the whole country was watching this.
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting. When I started doing research, I realized that my dad was actually in that Time magazine, article.
Ah.
So anyhow, at the time, New York City was not in very good shape. 2 years earlier, the city literally almost declared bankruptcy. And so the mayor had a lot of austerity measures. So, for example, lots of budget cuts to the police department. And so the police union was so unhappy, they actually made these flyers called Fear City. And they would, when tourists would come out at Port Authority, they'd hand them the flyer saying, "Don't come to the city, we can't protect you," right?
I mean, the city was on the verge of bankruptcy. I guess what precipitated out at that time was all of this anti-New York feeling, I think, across the country. I mean, people were really just focusing in on, well, New York, maybe almost deserve it. I mean, it was just kind of dispiriting. But in fact, obviously, I mean, New York, I think everyone's come to know and love, especially in the post 9/11 era, as a place where community is really powerful. There are great things happening.
Right, that's true. But so in 1977, it sort of felt like the city was in economic collapse.
Yeah.
And so they had this blackout, and so 2,000 stores were looted, and 1,000 were burned, and it really felt like kind of like the end of civilization to a lot of people in New York. And so my family had this store at 98th and Broadway since 1934, and it was very neighborhoody. And our store was one of the ones that was completely destroyed. And so people were coming in all day asking my dad, "Are you going to stay? Like, are you going to stay?" And my dad, who was busy trying to figure out how to fix the store, he just put up a sign and stuck it on the window saying, "We are staying," so people would stop talking to him so he could, try and fix the store. And so people came in like with flowers, and they were crying, and they're like, "Well, if you're staying, we're staying." So that was sort of the idea behind the title.
And you remarked on the fact that, I mean, there are businesses like barbershops, for example, or bakeries, that clearly people have some kind of a sentimental attachment to. But I don't think it even occurred to your family, to your father, that people had that kind of sentimental attachment to your store, and that him deciding to stay would have this resonance with the people who lived in the neighborhood.
Yeah, it did actually. It sort of changed in some ways how my dad oriented to the neighborhood, because while he felt very connected to the neighborhood and he knew the neighbors, he grew up in that store. You know, he didn't really think of it as what you just said, that as a place where people felt like, you know, you're staying is having such a big impact on us that we feel like the neighborhood is probably won't go under if stores like you are staying. And so he actually took a much more explicitly community engagement role in the city. He got very involved in the beginning of Symphony Space, which became this landmark in the neighborhood. He, when the neighborhood actually started to gentrify, he got very involved in the fight for commercial rent stabilization. So for him, it was a sort of turning point of, oh, I actually am sort of an important stakeholder in the neighborhood.
So we're going to do this in a very non-linear way. We'll come back to some of the basics, like
Sure.
your family's history immigrating to this country, and establish a little bit more for folks who don't know New York City, where geographically this is located, and some of the other things. But I just wanted to start with a few family photos. And so, Mara, if we could start the sequence here. I think the first one we have is a picture of the two of you. Could you explain the context for that photo?
Yeah, so that's the front of the store. It's obviously a very tightly cropped photo, but so my family owned the store from 1934 until 2014, and then my dad no longer owned the store, and someone else owned the store. And at this point, the gentrification was so crazy in the neighborhood that the rents were completely untenable, and so the person who took over the store sort of abruptly closed it 2 years later. And I happened to hear about it from people I know in New York, and it just so happened that my dad and I were going to be in the neighborhood for a funeral. So he contacted the landlord to see if we could get into the store just to take some photos. At this point, I was already writing the book, and the landlord didn't.
So this was roughly 2013?
No, so 2016.
2016, okay.
So we couldn't get in the store to take photos, so we just took photos outside the store.
Okay, next photo please, Mara. This is your dad in the store, right?
Yes, this is my dad probably in the 1980s. So
just for so your dad was Al, right?
Yeah, my dad's Al
Rubin.
Rubin, and so the store at the time, I mean, if anyone had ever been in an appliance store in the 1980s, there's just like rows of televisions and rows of boom boxes, and so that's my dad in front of 20 televisions, which appear to be playing Rhonda.
And this is your mom and dad?
My mom and dad, probably in the 1970s. My
Okay.
mom's Sandra.
All right, can we just, okay, well, we'll come back to that in a second, but, and this is you about the age of 10, so this is about the time of the blackout.
Yes,
within a year or two.
I was 11 at the blackout,
11,
so yeah, so
okay.
maybe a year or two before that. Yep.
And just to continue the narrative briefly while we look at this other great picture of your father, I mean, essentially at that time, even though you were living in Suffern, New York, which is the other side of the Hudson on the New Jersey-New York line, this neighborhood was really important to you because you were part of the life of the store. You would run errands down to the 83rd Street version of the store. And one of the things I wanted to invoke briefly was the story of you being in the front window. Could you explain why that was the case?
Yeah, so the thing about, if you're not familiar with the Upper West Side of New York City, so the store's on 90th and Broadway, and so the subway line runs up and down Broadway. And so hundreds of thousands of people will walk up and down Broadway all day long. And the 96th Street, so 2 blocks away, is one of the main subway stations. So there's just a lot of people that walk by that storefront. And so at the time, before the looting and before the store was destroyed, there was this glass vestibule. And so you could sort of stand in the glass vestibule and it sort of seems like you're almost out on the sidewalk. And so in 1976, when those arcade video games were coming out, the ones that are as big as the Pac-Man kind of things.
Pong, but then the next generation of those video games,
Yeah, so they were a new thing then. No one really knew what they were. And so my dad was curious about, well, could I sell them? Would people buy them? So he bought one. It was an Evel Knievel stun cycle. And so he paid me $1 an hour to stand in the storefront window and play video games to try to attract people as they came by. And so that was how I spent my Saturdays when I was 9 and 10.
And that was your claim to fame, because I'm sure you're pretty prominent there. I mean, there were probably people who passed by every day who recognized you. Huh?
Yeah, and it also, I mean, I like to say that, in terms of jobs, it's really just been downhill, ever since that. So.
Hey, Mara, let's actually cut ahead to the map, if we could, starting with that wide shot of that explains a little bit more where this neighborhood is. So this is the greater Manhattan area, greater New York area, and so just you mentioned Suffern, but I think it may be even a little bit off the frame. So just hold on to it for a second. Go back to the other one if you could, please, Mara. So upper left, you're on the other side of the Hudson. That's where you live,
Right.
but you're commuting into this store. And again, Manhattan, for those of you who don't know, just to the east of the Hudson River, the other boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens, off to the side, Bronx off to the east, and now zoom in a little bit more. Next shot, please. And so the Upper West Side, we'll see this in a little bit with the satellite view in just a second, but it's not too far from Central Park. Other things that people are familiar with, Riverside Church is a little bit up the way at about 110th, I think. Columbia University is at the top of the picture. And then next shot, if we could. And again, I think one of the reasons we want to include this is just it gives that sense in the middle of the city of what a presence Central Park is in terms of being a green area. But let's just continue to zoom on in. I'll give Jen a chance to establish context. This is the particular neighborhood with the red flag there showing that corner of 98th and Broadway. And then one more zoom. You get some sense of it. But come back in the studio now, I guess. Then this will show you the actual corner, which is off to the left there, where the store itself was,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, what you got buildings, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 stories tall on top of a level where you have the businesses on the lower level, but that was very typical in the neighborhood, right?
Yeah, if I could just give
Sure.
a little history.
Yeah, please.
So it used to be before, so in the late 1800s, most of the people who lived in Manhattan lived in the lower part of Manhattan because that's where the factories were, that's where the jobs were, right?
Yep.
And there was no public transportation that was rapid. So the only people who lived up by 98th Street were people who were very wealthy, and it was sort of their country homes, which is sort of hard to imagine, but that's sort of what it was. And so then in the late 1800s, they built what was called an elevated railroad. So that it was like a train that was 20 or 30 feet above you.
Like in the Loop in Chicago.
Right.
Yep.
And so that was when people first were able to start moving further up in the city. But then in 1904, they built the subway, the first subway. So when they built the subway and it was up and down Broadway, that's when all of these incredible buildings were built. And the idea was to build these luxury hotels that people would live in. And each one is grander than the next one, right? And they built, I don't know, it's in my book, so I knew at some point, but they built 60 of them or something, up and down Broadway. And so the idea is that commerce would be on the bottom floor, right? So that's when suddenly there was all this commercial life on Broadway. So that started in probably between 1904 and 1920 was when a lot of those buildings came in. And that's when Broadway became known as the Avenue for Commerce. And so partly why it was so a place people wanted to do business, and it's why my grandfather, even though he's living in the Bronx, decided to open his radio repair shop there, is because you had Central Park, 3 blocks away, and then you had Riverside Park by the Hudson River, 2 blocks away. And then after they built Central Park, they then created this sort of garden median in between Broadway. So in between, on both sides of Broadway, you had all these benches, so people are sitting on the benches. And they expanded the sidewalks, so they wanted to make it seem Parisian. And so it just was just a place to do business. And so that's why there's so many businesses there.
So you thousands of businesses in that strip between Central Park and the river. You had, and they were generally locally owned. They weren't parts of chains, but you had butcher shops and bakeries and electronic stores and just anything that you could want, you essentially find in that neighborhood. It seems like.
Yeah, one of my favorite things was I went through the phone book records, so I could see, year by year what stores were on the block, starting in 1910 or something. And so you could see that up until probably the early 60s, there was between 25 to 40 stores per block, because each one was small and each one did one thing. You got your shoe repaired here, you bought your bread here, somebody made your dress here. And so that's just what it was like. So when my grandfather opened the business in 1934, he was one of those businesses. So I think there was, in 1934, there was 500 businesses in a 20-block radius.
And we'll explore this theme later, but we've touched on it a little bit. But the whole idea of gentrification was that these neighborhoods that were so diverse in terms of these locally owned businesses, over time, chain stores started coming in, the rents started being out of reach of most of the people. I think your father was explaining it to people that when your lease was up, probably so was your future in that neighborhood. But this is part of a bigger picture, and it doesn't just play itself out in New York, but it seems like it's played itself out in particularly tragic ways there. But I mean, there's a danger that this will happen in places like Madison, as you know, State Street could become virtually all chain stores and not locally owned ones, for example.
Right. I'm not an economist, just in terms of, how well I'm able to talk about some of these things. But it's interesting. I did a book talk up in Baraboo, right? And I was curious how people in a more rural area would connect with the book. And I think what this has in common for everyone is no matter what community you live in, you want to be able to have a meaningful say in the fate of your community, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what people want. And so how this played out in New York and how it's played out in rural areas that have lost their small businesses for different reasons, maybe it's because of Walmart or other reasons, which is that you don't get a say. I mean, if a rent, like for example, in my dad's neighborhood, the rent went up multiple hundreds of %, and so it's not like you can suddenly, there was a guy who owned a stationery store that had been there for 40 or 50 years, and he said, what am I going to do, start charging $15 for a roll of tape? Like, I can't.
Yeah.
Who's going to buy it? No one's going to buy that kind of tape. And so I think what it has in common is what kind of say do you have as to what's going to be in your neighborhood?
Where we met was at the Sterling North Book Festival in Edgerton, and the buzz that I heard afterwards, I think there were two ways that people really identified with your story, partly because almost everybody has either been to New York or wants to go to New York. And so of course it's depicted in films and popular literature and everything else, so that people feel in some ways they know New York. And then to hear you talk about those changes, I think really put in perspective this place that they'd come to know and love, what had happened. But precisely what you're talking about with Baraboo, I mean, every city has had to deal with the winds of change, and very often business decisions are made that aren't necessarily in the best interests of a city or a neighborhood. And that, I mean, that's the theme in the book. That's also really evokes who your father was and why he really tried to go against the tide and to remain there and to remain in a place where he could help build community. The store wasn't just a store. It was so much more than that.
Right, and I think, when I first started writing this book, and I'm like, well, okay, so what's the point of the book? Like, what am I trying to say with this book? I wasn't setting out to write a 3-generation family memoir. Kind of what interested me is, I'm a cheerleader for small businesses. I try and shop in them as much as I can. And I feel like, you read all the time all these articles where people are talking about how many small businesses went under or bemoaning Amazon or whatever. But I feel like what exactly do you lose when a long-time business goes under? Like, what do you lose when you lose someone who's been there for 80 years or someone who's been there for 50 years? Like, it's a tangible thing that you lose. There's actual stories about, like my grandfather helped spy for the FBI during the Cold War through the store. Like, there's all kinds of things that, happen in these things that have been there for 80 years. And so I wanted to try and tell that story. Like, this is what you lose. Even though this is just one example, there's many examples.
So in the book, you do focus in fairly early on the blackout. But I think maybe a good way to go right now, you mentioned, I think the first passage you have marked in the book was just evoking that moment with you as a child, what that meant. And you're a beautiful writer. I think this just really evokes you channeling your own memories of that time and how you were connected to this larger story. Do you mind sharing that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I think, for anyone who's written a book, I was like, well, how do you start it, right? Because this book it's the story of the store, and my dad's for sure the main character. My grandfather's probably the secondary character. I'm probably the tertiary character, or whatever. But I did want to sort of right from the beginning sort of share like my love for small businesses. So
absolutely. Again, the book is We Are Staying.
Okay. In the summer of '76, I was the kid every kid wanted to be. I was paid $1 an hour to play video games. Standing in the glass vestibule of Radio Clinic, I demonstrated to the world the latest in modern technology, the Atari Arcade video game. I mainly played Stunt Cycle, a game modeled after Evel Knievel's famous Kings Island jump, where he cleared 14 Greyhound buses. The game allowed you to turn the throttle on your handlebar controller and try to equal his stunt on the screen. Arcade video games were new in 1976. Dad knew there was no better way to sell these video games than to have a 10-year-old kid play them in the window. The store was located on New York City's Upper West Side, and I drew the attention of the thousands of people who passed by the store each day. Standing in the front vestibule, using the plastic steering wheel on the arcade console, I carried on a family tradition of gimmicks that started in 1934 when my grandpa put on his white doctor smock. Leon, who was my grandfather, opened Radio Clinic when the streets of New York were packed tight with what we now call startups. Grandpa fled the Cossacks and Bolsheviks in Russia in 1920 after his father was killed in the Pale of Settlement, which was a geographic area where Russian Jews lived, and he and his family settled in New York City when he was 12. He learned to repair radios, and then he turned that skill into a business when he opened Radio Clinic. In the 1930s, it was easy for European immigrants to get a lease and start a business. If you had an idea or a skill, money for the first month's rent, and a courage to strike out on your own, Broadway was yours.
And by the way, you started reading that when I was trying to figure out chapters that you could read. I was just drawn in because that first chapter just really takes you down such an interesting path, and one thread leads to another. It's a fascinating book that really does draw you in.
Thanks.
And I guess the other thought that I just wanted to invoke here, I was remembering, when I heard you speak at this Early North Book Festival. And other people in the room had this experience too, but it brought up memories of family for me. My paternal grandfather was one of the senior engineers at Western Electric, and so a lot of the things that were in your dad's store probably were things that he helped invent. I mean, he was one of the hundreds of people that led to the development of the transistor and other things. And he was the greatest granddad to have, like, to watch the moon landing with, because he could explain everything.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah.
And he was cool. And then my maternal grandfather started a corner grocery store about the same time that your store started in the 1920s. And it developed into a chain of supermarkets. But he always remembered that sense of community and the paying back. He had employees that stayed with him for 30, 40, 50 years that had loyalty because he always watched out for his employees. He watched out for the community. And when he passed away, his obituary was on the front page of the Richmond paper. And it was mostly about the good things he did, with kind of an asterisk to all the things he did in business. But it reminds me a lot of your dad that way.
Yeah, well, the thing that's been really gratifying is, I guess this book's been published for about 6 months, and I get emails from tons of people who read the book who have their own stories, right? And so, I mean, that's the thing. I think because there used to be so many small businesses, in every city and every town, that there's just a lot of us that if you go back 1 or 2 or 3 generations, we have that story in our family.
Absolutely. Mara, I'm going to do things out of sequence again. We will come to the blackout in just a second, but I actually wanted to start with a couple of pictures of Radio Row going into Radio City and a few other things, if you can bring those up out of sequence. So Radio Row was part of New York City on the lower west side. Now, the earlier World Trade Center, post 9/11, the new World Trade Center, are basically on that site.
Right.
Radio Row is still marked as a street off of Broadway down there, and but it was a very special place. And if we have those pictures, why don't we start with them? Where electronic stores happen, and was it your father that had a history in that neighborhood? Or?
Yeah, so my dad sort of refers to that as like a tinkerer's paradise, right? He said if you think of it as like a large fruit market, but instead of fruit, there's just all kinds of various nuts and bolts and things you would need for radio repair. And so I guess my dad was a kid in the, I should know this, 30s? I guess in the 30s, 40s? Anyway, so if you're a small radio repair shop, right, you can't afford to have every possible part. You have the parts that you need for the most common repairs. But if someone comes in and needs something to be repaired that you don't have a part for, you would go down to Radio Row and get it. So that was my dad's job as a kid. He would take the subway down to Radio Row. Lots of people built their own radios, or they built their own ham radios or stuff like that. So you would go down to Radio Row and you would find your parts and you would build it. And it was, at the time when it was raised to make room for the World Trade Center, there was definitely an uproar at the time. People are not happy to see that go.
If we can go back to the blackout sequence that follows those initial several pictures we've already shared. There's one really striking one looking across the East River. Here it is. That's the Brooklyn Bridge at top. But what you said, 8. What was the time of the blackout?
I can't remember if the cascading series of events started at 8:37 or ended at 8:37, but around 8:30 in the evening, between 8:30 and 9, is when the power went out.
In the narrative of the book, about 11, you said the blackout had been ongoing for 2 or 3 hours at that point. So that
it's somewhere between 8:30 and 9 is when it started.
And next one, we've got a couple of pictures. One on the left is just kind of evoking how people use this as an opportunity to come together as a family. You didn't have electricity, so you had to kind of go back to basic stuff. I don't know, whatever it might be, reading by candlelight or playing board games or whatever. And then on the other side, what is it? No lights, no food, but lots of liquor.
Right.
So the restaurants and the other places were kind of having fun with it.
Right.
And if you go on to the next slide, so here's an example. I don't know, it looks like Sardi's or something like that, but maybe not. But it's one of the fancier restaurants, maybe, or it could be a neighborhood one. I don't know. But anyway, essentially dining by candlelight. The kitchen's making do because the food was going to spoil otherwise, so they really had to prepare it quickly.
And I know there is, I read, many articles about what was happening during the blackout. So there actually was some famous story that at Sardi's it was Andy Warhol and a whole bunch of famous people, and people had driven their cars and shined their lights on so they could have, a well-lit dinner. And so people who lived in neighborhoods where there wasn't a lot of poverty were having a good time. If you lived in a neighborhood where there was poverty, it erupted in looting. That was.
And there was a 65 blackout, kind of similar, that anyway, it was more the stories of people coming together and everything, but 77 was very different than that blackout.
Yeah, so the blackout that happened in, I can't remember, was it 65 or 68?
I was thinking 65, but I could be, yeah.
So the one in the 60s, first of all, I think it happened in November.
Yeah.
I think it started during the daytime, and so it wasn't a heat wave, and the city wasn't in as bad shape economically. I think for some communities in New York City in 1977, I think the unemployment rate for young men was like 80%. It was higher than Depression era unemployment rate. So it was a different time, plus of the fact that it was in the middle of a heat wave. The lights went off after dark, so all the stores were already closed. So it was like sort of lots of different variables.
In 1965, I think we were sharing memories of this TV show Family Affair, which I think actually went on the air a few years later than that. But I mean, the 1960s was this time of prosperity. If you look at what Mad Men or some of the shows that take place in that era, I mean, it was just the city was growing and bustling, and we kind of romanticized that time. I think the Woody Allen's film about Manhattan, maybe took place or maybe it was later. Anyway, but anyway, we do romanticize that as a time. But by contrast, about a decade later, by the late 70s, again, what you're describing, that economic downturn, potential bankruptcy, especially poorer neighborhoods, a lot of distress was coming into the city's life.
Yeah, well, I think it had started sooner too, because so part of what happened is when suburbanization started happening. And so back when the FH loans were available for people, but FHA loans were only available to white people. So a lot of middle-class white people who had a chance to have home ownership were leaving the city and moving to the suburbs. And then the manufacturing base also left, right? So you have the people who remained in the city had less money, and then there were less manufacturing jobs, which really had been sort of the jobs of entry, right? Like when my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side, for example, when they came to the United States, they got factory jobs, right? Those were the jobs that helped you sort of get your foot on the economic ladder and start climbing, right? And so those were all sort of going away by the late 50s to the 60s. So by the 70s, the impact was larger.
And like a lot of those folks who visited there, I mean, I saw this play out when I was 4 or 5, I think was the first 1964 or 5. I remember going to the Central Park Zoo. My mom's friends, Rosemary, had an apartment, a tiny efficiency apartment across from Riverside Church. The kitchen that was no bigger than the space between you and I. And,
right.
and anyway, I just fell in love with New York and my mom and dad because they were involved in World Council of Church issues and missions programs. We would go actually to the neighborhood about 10 blocks or so north of you a lot. And so I remember that. But then when I turned 18 in 1978, remember a friend and I and my mom all coming to New York, and we stayed, George and I stayed in the 34th Street Y, I think, and we were just exploring and how fun it was, just to be young people getting to know the city. But Times Square was a whole different place back then. It was before the Disneyfication.
Right.
In the early 80s, I remember taking a bus tour of struggling neighborhoods, because by that time I was working for nonprofits and doing stuff. But Hell's Kitchen, for example, was hell.
Right.
But it's not that anymore. Everything has become gentrified. And so since the 70s, there's really been this trend, what some people would say, is a revitalization of New York. But the revitalization has come with a process that has really pushed people out of the neighborhoods who were there for generations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, whether it's a city having an austerity budget or whether there's gentrification or whatever it is, there's like always a human cost to whatever's happening, whatever the large scale, economic force is happening, there's always a human cost. And so, I mean, that's the thing that for me, when I think about a store that's been in one neighborhood for 80 years, so over the course of 80 years, there was the Great Depression, right? And then there was post-World War II, crowding in the city when people came back from World War II. And then there was, suburbanization, and then there was urban renewal, and then there was economic decline, and then there was gentrification, right? So all of that happened. And so a store, like a human being, weathers all those things. And so for me, it's like, okay, so the radio clinic survived the Depression, radio clinic survived economic downturn, radio clinic survived looting, but radio clinic could not survive gentrification, which is, the sad part of the story.
Well, and it was kind of, it was the, what's the metaphor of the frog in the boiling water? It didn't happen overnight.
No, and the thing that's interesting for a small business, which is, different than I think for a person trying to figure out how they're going to pay the rent of their apartment, is initially when the neighborhood first starts to improve, because if you own a business, you want to have people in your neighborhood who have money to buy things. Yep. And New York City is a walking city. You're not going to, people until the stores went away, people shopped where they lived. People walked to where they could go. And so to suddenly have people who could buy a TV, and I could maybe buy a new refrigerator, that kind of thing. That's good news. Someone who could go out to dinner 3 times a week, that's good news. Until it isn't,
Yeah.
But initially it wasn't sort of doom and gloom initially.
So unlike 42nd Street or Times Square in general, or Fifth Avenue or other places that tend to be tourist spots that people from all over the world travel in, I guess it strikes me, there probably were visitors to this neighborhood, and it was designed to be kind of a Paris type setting. But in many ways, it was grounded in the people who lived there, maybe more so than those more public places in New York. Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah, I think for people who aren't familiar with that neighborhood, so there's just a lot of people in that neighborhood. The building, you had the picture up earlier, so the building that Radio Clinic was in, which probably that building goes a third of the block and goes up, I don't know, maybe 15 stories, and it goes pretty wide. There could be 1,000 people living in each building,
Mm-hmm.
And then you have Riverside, you have West End Avenue, Riverside Avenue, Broadway, Amsterdam, Columbus, Central Park West, and then you have the side streets. So there's many, many thousands of people who live in that neighborhood. And because, if you live on the 14th floor of an apartment, these are not apartments that have central air, right? So, there could be 1,000 people per building that need an air conditioning unit, So there's just a lot of people living in the neighborhood that could used to be able to sustain these businesses.
So I'm trying to think of other pop cultural references that would be helpful to people. But you quote Elaine Bennis, a character from Seinfeld, and that was a Seinfeld neighborhood in some ways, wasn't it?
Yeah, I actually the coffee shop they ate in was in that neighborhood,
Okay.
and then so that was a neighborhood they walked around in for sure.
I'm thinking maybe The Odd Couple, and anyway.
Yeah, yes, Odd Couple, and actually because Tony Randall was a longtime customer of the store.
Oh, is he? Okay.
Well, that's the thing. There was that thing about that neighborhood is there's just a lot of famous people,
Right.
in and out of that store. So.
And the Dakota is a little ways down the park, but where John Lennon is from. But that's an Upper West Side landmark.
Yeah. So that's probably 20 blocks away.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's return to the story of the blackout, if we could, Maura, with those pictures that follow the first ones we showed. Anyway, if you take off where you left, because I think we were So this was an iconic photo. Can you explain the context of it?
So, because it looks like it's daylight, so my guess is it's probably 6 or 7 or 8 in the morning. So so the lights went out between 8:30 and 9. The looting happened all night long, through the night, and then into the morning. And so, I mean, it really was a free-for-all. I mean, there was this really interesting report. The Ford Foundation did this report, and so it actually sort of cataloged what types of stores, 100 of these kinds of stores, 1,000 of these kinds of stores, whatever. And so, if you owned a store that sold sneakers, everything was gone. And if you owned an electronics store, everything was gone. And so this is just the morning after, and there's still, I guess, the remains of the looting happening. Most of the looting happened during the night, though.
And then this is an overview. I think this might be Brooklyn, but just the sense of, again, the debris in the streets, the cars kind of ajar. People were outside because it was hot. So there was an element of chaos of this, and also an element of community, it seems.
Yeah, and I think the thing I want to say about it being hot is if you haven't been in a city, like a dense city with buildings everywhere during a heat wave, living on the 10th floor.
You can fry an egg on the blacktop.
Yeah, I mean, it's the heat's just oppressive in a way that it's not in a place where there's trees that can absorb it, where there's grass, so it's like unbearable. It's pretty unbearable.
Absolutely. Next shot. So this is a picture that your father took.
Yeah, this is at the very, very beginning of the looting. So my dad was
This is the storefront.
This is the storefront. They're prying open the gates. So my dad happened to be in the city, and so the lights went out, and he got himself to the store, and this was like just basically what people did is they affixed metal chains to it, and then attached a car to the chains, and then you drive, and then you pull the gate off, and then once the gate's off, you can break the windows, and then you're in.
So under ordinary circumstances, these gates would have been enough security for your father, for almost any other business, but there was something extraordinarily happening here. I mean, with the intensity of the folks who were doing the rioting and the looting was just off the charts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just this opportunity, right? I mean, so basically, the lights go out. Many thousands of people, decide to loot the stores. There's a whole interesting reason why the police were ineffective, which I could share if you want, but the police were ineffective for a variety of reasons. And
could you explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, so partly, I can't remember the name of the law, but sometime in the 60s, they changed. It used to be that if you were a police officer in New York City, you had to live in the city.
Yeah.
But that law changed, right? So a lot of the police officers were not in the city. The police were really angry at the city because of the austerity budget. I think they had just floated the idea that they only need to have one cop in a patrol car, which people were not happy about.
Oh, yeah.
So when the order came that every able-bodied police officer had to report to duty, not everyone reported. So that was one thing.
Because it wasn't their city, and they were pissed off.
No, they were pissed. I mean, 2 years earlier, they were literally passing out these flyers called Fear City, saying, "We can't protect you. Don't come to the city." Like so that was part of it. Then the ones that did report, it took a while to get there if they were already home.
Yeah.
And then, in sort of a big miscalculation of the night, they were ordered to report to the precinct where they work. So. But once they got there, then it's like, oh, wait a minute, but that is the precinct where it's happening. So by the time they got to where it was happening, it took a very long time. And some of them, had been home. They came in shorts. They weren't in sort of the police gear. And there was a lot of police that were interviewed that were basically saying, like, I mean, even if we arrest someone and then we have to take them in, that takes a while to process. And then there's less of us on the street. So they really were just trying to kind of scare people away, to move them away from the stores, but they weren't arresting most of the people, although they arrested a lot of people.
So to revisit that day in a little more detail, your father was on the Upper East Side, I think, at a meeting?
He was in a meeting on the Upper East Side, so he drives to the Upper West Side. It doesn't occur to him that the store is going to be looted. It does not occur to him for a minute. What he's worried about is all of his stuff, all the air conditioners, all the big stuff is stored in the basement. And so really the only way to get it from the basement to the store is there's a freight elevator. And if the power went out, it would cause flooding for reasons I don't really quite remember why it would cause flooding, and that would short out the elevator, in which case you wouldn't have a working elevator. So he was going to go, he had a hand pump, and he was just going to hand pump the water away from the elevator until the lights went on. But then, of course, he gets there and realizes, oh, that's the least of my that's the least of my problems because my store is being destroyed.
Right.
And so he watched it for a while. He kind of encouraged people to leave his store alone, and they were not interested in that advice. And so he ran 2 blocks to 96th Street, where police were directing traffic because it was a main thoroughfare, and they're worried of car accidents. And so the police came with him and helped get people to leave. But then the police went back to 96th Street, so then the looters returned, and they kind of did that dance several times.
And your father, at some point, was shouting at them to leave.
Yeah, and they shouted back,
Yeah, that wasn't going to get it.
Yeah, and then he's like, yeah, that's not a good idea. So he ran. And then at some point he like, this is, it's not doing my health any good to watch this happen. I'm just going to leave.
And he stopped in briefly at the pizza place next door. He discovered that the pizza place owner had already called his home to let him know, and then let your mom know what was going on.
Yeah, well, so the pizza slice store next door, he had a gun, and so he offered my dad a gun, and my dad's like, yeah, I don't see that ending well, so he didn't take the gun. Yeah, and then he learned that my mother had heard, had heard, so he tried to call my mom, but at that point he couldn't call out because the phone lines were too busy.
And I'm trying to think. So you were up late that night. I mean, I forget, when did you find out what was going on?
Well, so my memory is that I was watching a baseball game.
You were 11. Roughly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so we knew the lights went out in the city.
Yeah.
But we didn't know a whole lot else.
You still had power in Suffern, or maybe not. I can't remember if it was the whole Northeast that went out, or we'll have to research that.
Yeah. But I know I was watching a baseball game.
Okay.
And I don't know if the game. I think
was
the game.
Yankee Stadium or something, or
it was a Mets game.
Mets game. Okay.
But I think the lights went out for us too.
Okay.
All I know is I didn't know till I woke up in the morning that there was a problem.
Your father had already gone back into the city.
Yeah, so he came home probably like at 1 a.m. Then I think he left again at like 5 a.m. to get back in there.
And you just mentioned parenthetically that at the time, at that age, one of the things that gave you some sense of security is to have a rock by your bed.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was talking about how I've just always been an anxious kid, and so I actually kept a rock under my pillow, because that way, if somebody came in to kill me or something, then I could take the rock and break the glass of I had a framed something or other, and then I'd have the glass shard, and then I could,
I think I had a pet rock about that time, but it had a similar purpose.
Yeah, so I could just fight my way out. So yeah, yeah.
I guess where I'm going with this, I'm just wondering, so when did you first go back to the store? How did this impact you? Because the store was a very important place to you and important to your family.
Yeah, it was interesting in writing the book and talking to my dad and talking to my brother, who's a couple years older. He went in, so my dad went in the next day, which was Friday, but then Saturday, the day they were trying to open the store, my brother went in to help with the final cleanup or whatever, and I don't know why I didn't go. I was trying to figure, like, why didn't I go? Maybe I was just too young. But I don't know. But so I wasn't there for that. So I didn't see the store probably until it was.
Well, you remarked that your brother, for example, helped. There was a phase where the looters hadn't been able to get out of the basement where a lot of air conditioners were sold. So your father's imperative was to sell these air conditioners in a really hot week in New York, aside from the blackout.
Yeah, so my brother was there for that day. Maybe my guess is we must have thought I wouldn't have been very useful, because we do need some.
You pointed out, the kind of thing that you did, like sweeping up glass or something, when it might have been a natural thing for you to do. But
so basically the only way, so when you have a store and when your entire, most of your merchandise is taken, that's not really a good position to be in, right? So, and because you sort of get the merchandise on lease. So my dad actually still had to pay the money to the manufacturer for the merchandise, but now there was no merchandise, right? So we didn't have any way to pay them back because the merchandise no longer existed. And so so that put him in a very bad position. And like any small business owner, you exist on a very small margin, right? So it's not like you have a lot, of cushion to help you out. But the air conditioners, which were the best, the way he made his most money was air conditioners, they were actually in the basement. And so they were not stolen. And so the only way to get to the basement, other than the freight elevator, and the freight elevator actually came up on the sidewalk outside, right? So there's no way for them to get into the freight elevator. is there's this like very steep stair staircase that's kind of treacherous, right? And so so you get in from there's like a trap door in the back office, and you go down this staircase to get to the basement. And so that's where all the air conditioners were. And you could see that people found that, got down there, and tried to bring it, but you could not safely. There's just no way to get up. You would fall. You would fall and die. You'd have to. So all of the air conditioners were still there, and so the city was still on this heat wave, right? So my dad's only hope was to sell these air conditioners, and that could kind of keep him limping forward. And so then the question is, well, how the freight elevator shorted out as he had imagined, so he couldn't use a freight elevator. So each one, it probably took half an hour to get each one into the store, because you had to put it on one of those dollies with wheels, and then you had to wheel it all the way through the basement so you could get into the residential part of the building. Then you had to go like to the back of the building, and then there was, like there's a, what's the word? It's a ramp, so you could take it up the steep ramp that takes you like on the other side of this, around the corner. And then you have to get the dolly onto the sidewalk, and then you wheel it, down the sidewalk, turn the corner, down the sidewalk into the store.
It sounds like a lot of hassle, but I mean, one of the things you really convey is that small business person or the restaurateur, the margin of profit is so small that you have to take advantage of opportunities like that. You have to do everything you can.
Yeah, because I mean, even a tiny hiccup in operations could be disastrous, and this was, not a tiny hiccup. This was a large hiccup, or I don't know.
But the other thing that interests me about that time is that when your father put the sign up, "We are staying," again, it had the wider impact with neighbors. But for example, I think it was 4 months later, he was lecturing at Columbia University.
Yeah.
And he epitomized this "let's persevere, let's stay, let's save our neighborhoods" type ethos, and he was a spokesperson for that cause in many ways.
The thing about my dad, and I think one of the things that I think makes the book interesting is, in the end, and it occurred to me sort of halfway through the book that, actually the store isn't the main character, the humans are the main characters, which then makes my dad the main character. Is my dad he's a hero, but he's a flawed hero, right? Which I think makes him more interesting. And so he has this optimism, which is lovely, but it's also quite compulsive, right? So there's an unfortunate side to his optimism, right? But so it's that optimism, I think, that helped him save the business in 1977. And my dad's this really likable guy, right? He's sort of a classic sort of older New York person, right? And he's he talks to everyone. He loves to talk. There's no one he doesn't like to talk to. And so because of where the store is, there were a lot of people who taught at Columbia who were customers in the store. So I'm sure he and this business professor had many a conversation. And so the business professor was like, why don't you come in to be sort of a case study of what happens when everything goes wrong, which is how the recovery from the looting, how like everything went wrong. Like the city let him down, the banks let him down, everyone let him down. So that was why he was invited in.
Well, as you explored who your father is, I would imagine there was a dynamic tension between the kind of personality and the drive that he have, and maybe other people around him, because the way that he carried himself entailed a lot of risk taking, a lot of really having to be on the edge of things, and conventional wisdom might say that was a time to pack it up and just to think, well, this is done.
Right.
But I mean, so without venturing into dangerous territory here, are your mom or other family members or other people around him, was that hard sometimes that maybe people didn't get why your father was that way and really wanted him to maybe do the easier path?
So in terms of 1977, well, my brother and I were young, so we didn't really have an opinion.
Sure.
But I think in 1977, I think I talk about this in the book, I think my mom would have appreciated him consulting her about deciding to keep it open. But he basically decided to keep the store open while he was watching it be looted. So that glass vestibule that I talk about, that was actually where his father fixed sick radios. That was sort of the gimmick his father had to get people interested in the store, and that's where I played video games. My dad hated that vestibule because it took up space. And in a cramped New York City store, like you don't want to take up space.
Right.
So and he and his brother-in-law, who had been business partners, and they had different visions for the business, and he had just literally bought his brother-in-law out, I think a week before the looting, right? So he was a sole owner for the first time as the store was being looted. So when he heard the glass vestibule break, he's like, oh, now I can redo it how I want to do it, right? So, which to me seemed very like classic for my dad, which is even as everything's falling apart, he's like, oh, I see,
There's a silver lining
I see
here.
something here,
Yeah.
But so in 1977, it wasn't, his optimism wasn't quite so, it's later when the rents were rising and he didn't leave that I think there was a lot of strong feelings in the family about why are you making the decisions you're making, but not in 1977.
Gotcha. Mara, why don't we continue with the photos and the sequences we have them? We might have a couple more blackouts. I'm not sure where they go from here. Be about our 10-minute warning, by the way. So this is your father and his and his workers?
No, this is my grandfather.
Your grandfather, okay.
So this is the 1950s, and so that's the Hudson River. So once a year, they would rent a fishing boat, and they would just do a day of fishing. And so those were all that's my grandfather, which I think, he looks super cool to me with those glasses. I mean, I didn't know him at that age, but I don't even know what that soda is, but I think I like the look of the can.
You look like a guy who was a bit ahead of his time.
Yeah.
And freeze on this for just a second, Mara. And this is Raymond?
So this is Raymond. And so Raymond, I talk about him a lot in the book because he had probably like the largest, other than family members, he had the largest impact on the business. So when I talk about my grandfather and how they fled Russia after his father was murdered for being Jewish, and I talk about how, like, I think we all find our family story sort of fascinating and interesting because it is, but he was also like one of 900,000 Russian Jews fleeing, the country. So it's sort of both amazing and ordinary at the same time, right? And so I think about that with Raymond, so he was a young guy. He was part of the black migration from the south to the north, looking for sort of wider opportunity, and he, he helped liberate. I don't remember what.
World War II battle.
Yeah, he helped liberate. I think one of the Jewish, concentration camps, and so he has also this incredible story that's also sort of ordinary because he was one of many, many thousands who, migrated from the south to the north. And so when he started working at the store, my grandfather sort of noticed, really liked him a lot and sort of felt some similarities between the two of them. And so he sent Raymond to sort of radio repair shop so Raymond could sort of move up and do more stuff in the store. And he actually was my dad's mentor in many ways. So when my dad was a kid, he would go on delivery runs with Raymond. And I feel like my dad has told me so many stories about Raymond that Raymond sort of helped my dad become the person he is and the worker that he is
We've touched on this kind of the sweep of history from the 20s to the present day, but World War II was pretty fundamental to that. And I mean, what Tom Brokaw writes about that generation, I would imagine was very true. And I would imagine that spirit of GIs coming back, taking advantage of the GI Bill. I have an uncle that went to Harvard Law. Could have been a lawyer on Fifth Avenue. He ended up being an advisor to Haile Selassie. But I mean, I think of him. He came from working class Massachusetts. Suddenly there were new opportunities available to him. Anyway, I imagine those stories played out in different ways in that neighborhood too.
Yeah, oh, for sure it did. Although, yeah. So the reason why I like to talk about Raymond is so he had this huge impact on my dad as a kid.
Right.
And then when my grandfather dies and my dad becomes the owner of Radio Clinic, suddenly Raymond, now my dad's his boss, right? And so Raymond had mentored my dad, and Raymond maybe would like to have owned his own radio repair shop, but as a black man, he might not have gotten access to credit in the same way. And so my dad always felt like a very strong loyalty to Raymond. And so, so Raymond decided. The decisions my dad made moving forward when he thought about like Raymond and these other employees who all had been there when my dad was a kid, who he now was sort of responsible for their livelihood. And that was another sort of reason for him why he, fought so hard to keep the business open, because he felt responsible for their jobs.
Yeah,
in a way that I don't think you would if you didn't grow up as a kid with them as your mentors.
Gotcha. Next slide, if we could. Not sure what we're up to now, but. So anyway, this is 1992. This is just a little bit kind of off topic, but it was another heat wave. and just kind of showing folks lined up to get air conditioners. That is the store, right?
Yeah, so that's the store in the 1990s. And one of the things I realized when I was researching this book is how often the store, my dad, ended up in the newspaper, partly because I think a lot of journalists lived in the neighborhood, so it's probably easy, just to go over and take the photo. But so, yeah, this was, whenever there was a heat wave, there'd be people lined up to get air conditioners. And so my dad, they'd lock the door and only let in a few at a time so it wouldn't get overcrowded. And then if I was around, and if it wasn't me, it'd be someone else. My job was to run and get sodas, just to keep people, hydrated and happy. So that would be my
cool,
my high skill job. I'd get to buy people sodas.
And next slide.
That's the store, probably again in the 80s or something.
Okay. And next one, if we could. So we're down to just several minutes here, but we wanted to just touch a little bit on your family. This was your great-grandfather?
This is my great-grandfather. So he was the one, so they lived in Russia, and I think it was either in 1918 or 1919 he was killed because Jews were killed a lot. And so it was after he was murdered that they fled.
And this is another, flashing had another 20 years or so? Or?
Yeah, probably, or at least 10. That's my grandfather in the tie, his mom, and then my grandmother.
And then your father on the left and your grandfather on the right?
Yeah, that's their. They lived in an apartment in the Bronx, a couple blocks from then Yankee Stadium.
So we're going to have to be concise in our questions and answers at this point. But I mean, it's an immigrant story in a lot of ways, the story of your dad's store.
Oh, I very much think of this as an immigrant story. Excuse me. And I think a lot of the people who were starting businesses up and down Broadway in the 1920s, 1930s were mostly immigrants.
And the people who reviewed it, I think that's one of the themes that they really draw out of it, aside from the gentrification, the factors that led to the store having to shut down eventually. I mean, this was the story of New York. These immigrants who came in, who developed these local businesses that had this broader impact.
Yeah, my grandfather and his family came into the country illegally through Canada because the advice they were given is don't go to Ellis Island, you might not all get in. So you could land in Canada, and basically they just took a Pullman train from Canada to New York, and there they were.
Okay, let's keep going. So again, that's you in front of the store. What about what era?
So that would have been, I was in high school, probably 1988. I specialize in the no-skill jobs, so I painted the gate. We cooked bacon so people could come in and
that's what kids use,
buy
family-owned businesses. Yeah. I mean, I was a pastor's kid, and that's the kind of thing I did around the church, so I know what you mean.
Right.
And do we have more? Okay. So as we close out, we've just got a couple minutes here just to kind of summarize. But again, could you just reiterate some of the lessons or what the circumstances were of the store's closing? And again, you've already talked about this, but why is this a story that is so relevant to the here and now?
I mean, I think, and I'm probably repeating myself, but for me, it really is. What exactly are we losing when we lose these small businesses? What are we losing when we, so when in 1977, my dad could have picked up and left, but he didn't. He stayed even though he could have left in the early 70s when the neighbor was bad, but he didn't. So a chain store, a store that people that, have other options, people who, could just pick up and go somewhere else, what will stop them from doing that when a neighborhood falls in hard times, right? It's a business that is rooted and invested the neighborhood that stays, right? So we all lose a lot when we don't have these small businesses.
So the book again is We Are Staying. If we could go back to the cover shot one more time. So this is a self-published book. How do people get a copy of it?
Well, so if you live in the Madison area, you can buy it at Miss Street and Me, and I think Room of One's Own.
Monroe Street.
On Monroe Street, and I think Room of One's Own.
Last time I checked, yeah.
Yep. And you could get it on Amazon, or you could call any other bookstore, and they might not carry it in the store, but they would order it if you.
I'm trying to remember. Do you have a Facebook presence or other places where people can find out more about the book?
Yeah. So I have my website is rubingen.com, and the one thing that is my favorite part of the book that you could find on the website is I have a chapter by chapter playlist for each sort of decade of the life of the store and life of New York. So you could find that on my website.
So kind of a mixtape type thing?
Yeah, it's I've made I think there's 11 chapters, so there's 11 Spotify playlists.
And obviously part of your journey after writing the book has been to go to book festivals in places like Baraboo and Edgerton and all around.
Yeah.
I mean, is that really added to the experience for you?
Well, it's fun for me because, and you know, it doesn't come out in an interview, but I like to tell stories. I'm a good storyteller.
Yeah.
I produced the Moth Story Slam here in Madison.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I wanted to bring that in.
Yeah. So a book talk is super fun because I can just tell stories from the book, and so I've really been enjoying it, doing that. That's been a lot of fun.
Well, hey, there's a whole lot more we could talk about, and maybe we should bring you back along with some folks who can talk about some of the other social trends and everything that are, epitomized by the book. But we got a lot out there, I think, in an hour. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you too. I thought, oh my gosh, an hour, that's a long time, but it went really quick.
It really did.
Yeah.
Hey, Jen Rubin, thanks so much again. We Are Staying is the book. This is John Quinlan. Please do. We're going to be trying to get more shows out into the pipeline as the year goes on here. Forwardforum.net is a place you can find out more. Thanks to all the good folks, including Mara Trusty, our producer here at the Sun Prairie Media Center. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great week.